He rescued them from a shelter, two lynx bulls, abandoned and alone. They were wild, untamed, and struggling to survive. But what happened next will leave you speechless. He didn't just save them, he became part of their world. These lynx, once distrustful of humans, soon formed a bond with their rescuer unlike anything you'd expect. Their connection grew so deep that when danger struck, they returned the favor in a way no one could have predicted. Curious yet? Stick around to find out how these two powerful creatures repaid the man who gave them a second chance. You won't believe what they did. Hi everyone, welcome to our channel. Today, I'm excited to share a new story with you. Please subscribe us. The shelter had seen its fair share of animals in need, but nothing like the two lynx bulls who had just arrived. Both were in poor condition, thin, malnourished, and fearful of human presence. The man who was called in to rescue them, David McIntyre, had seen it all before. As a wildlife conservationist, David had spent years rescuing and rehabilitating animals in need, but the challenge these lynx bulls presented was like no other. Their wild instincts made them hard to approach, their mistrust of humans palpable. The shelter staff was concerned. Lynx are naturally solitary and territorial animals, and these two were no exception. David approached the cages with careful steps, his years of experience guiding him. He understood the risks. These were not house pets, they were powerful, untamed creatures. The first lynx, a strong male with deep amber eyes, glared at him from behind the bars, his body tensed in anticipation. The second, a slightly smaller female, stood silently in the corner, her body language just as wary. David didn't rush. He knew that earning their trust would take time, patience, and understanding. He had rescued animals in worse condition, but something about these lynx felt different. Their eyes spoke of a past filled with fear and mistreatment, but David wasn't one to give up easily. He promised them both a chance to heal, to grow, and to reclaim their place in the wild. This was his life's work, and he wouldn't let them down. When David arrived at the shelter, the lynx bulls were exactly as described, shrouded in fear, their eyes wide with uncertainty. The larger male, with a thick coat of graying fur, paced relentlessly back and forth in his enclosure. His muscles rippled with tension, and his sharp claws scraped against the concrete floor. His size and strength were intimidating, but it was the mistrust in his eyes that made David pause. The female, smaller yet equally fierce, huddled in the corner of the enclosure. Her fur was thin in places, a sign of malnutrition, and her once pristine coat now looked ragged. She didn't move much, keeping her distance from the others, her gaze fixed on David as if sizing him up. David knew the risks of approaching such a wild pair. Lynx are solitary by nature, and these two had likely been through their own traumatic experiences before arriving at the shelter. He assessed their condition carefully. The male was underweight, with visible wounds along his flank that had likely been inflicted during fights or escapes. The female was even more fragile, her ribs showing beneath the sparse fur. Both had been isolated from the wild for far too long, and their physical and mental states were fragile. The staff expressed concern over their aggression. The lynx bulls hadn't shown signs of human trust, and their sharp claws and powerful jaws could pose a serious threat if they felt cornered. David stepped closer to the enclosure, speaking softly. His calm voice seemed to reach the lynx bulls, and for a moment, they paused. The male stopped pacing, his eyes narrowing, but he didn't react with violence. The female lifted her head slightly, her gaze wary yet not entirely hostile. David could feel their uncertainty, and he understood trust would not come quickly, but it was a start. David's days at the shelter blended into a routine, one that required patience and unwavering persistence. Every morning, he arrived before dawn to check on the lynx bulls. The first task was feeding them, a delicate operation. The male remained at the back of his enclosure, eyes fixed on David as he approached, yet he did not move closer. The female, though weaker, did the same. David carefully placed their food at a distance, speaking softly as he did. Each time he came, he made sure to move slowly and give them space, aware that sudden movements could trigger fear. Despite their initial distrust, David remained constant. He didn't rush. Each interaction, each meal was an opportunity for the Lynx bulls to learn that he was there to help. As the weeks passed, the Lynx bulls started to show subtle signs of progress. One morning, as David placed the food in the usual spot, the male slowly, cautiously, took a step forward. His amber eyes never left David, but he didn't retreat when David stepped closer. It was a small shift, but a shift nonetheless. David noticed the male's muscles were less tense, his movements more fluid, as if he was starting to accept the presence of another. The female remained more distant, but even she began to show signs of curiosity. She would watch David for longer periods, her eyes softening just slightly, and sometimes she would take a tentative step toward him before retreating back into the corner. David didn't push them, he allowed them to come to him when they were ready. He spent hours each day simply sitting outside their enclosures, reading aloud, his voice calm and reassuring. It was a tactic he had used with many animals before, letting them get used to the sound of his voice, associating it with safety rather than threat. Over time, the Lynx bulls seemed to respond. The female, though still cautious, allowed him to come closer. One day, she even sat by the edge of her enclosure, eyes half closed, as if at ease in his presence. The bond was still fragile, but it was growing. David continued to feed, groom, and observe them, taking care to never push them too far. The male was more willing to allow David to clean his coat, a process that involved moving close enough for David to gently touch his fur. It was a tentative moment, David's fingers brushing the male's thick, rough coat, but the lynx didn't pull away. There was no growl, no retreat. Just a moment of trust, however small. But David knew that their survival, their rehabilitation, depended on this fragile bond. He needed them to trust him, not just for their comfort, but for their future. In the wild, trust with humans could mean the difference between survival and peril. The stakes were high, and David was determined to see it through, even if it meant countless more days of patience. Each breakthrough, each small sign of trust, was a victory, a step closer to rehabilitating the lynx bulls and returning them to their rightful place in the wild. Despite his constant care, David soon encountered setbacks that began to test his patience and resolve. The lynx bulls, though showing subtle signs of trust, were still wild creatures at heart. The larger male, though slightly more relaxed, was still unpredictable, his deep-set instincts triggered by the smallest of changes in his routine. There were mornings when he would refuse to eat, retreating to the farthest corner of his enclosure, eyes wide and unblinking, a clear sign of stress. The female, still skittish, would dart away at any attempt to get closer than a few feet. It was frustrating, and at times, David questioned whether the bond he so desperately sought would ever come to fruition. Their health issues were another constant worry. The male, though stronger than the female, was still severely underweight. His ribs were visible, and his fur, while improving, remained thin in patches. The female's condition was more fragile, her bones seemed brittle, and her body often struggled to maintain a healthy weight. David spent hours monitoring their progress, trying different diets, supplements, and even speaking to other wildlife experts for guidance. Yet, the progress was slow, and there were times when he wondered if it was enough. The lynx bulls were growing stronger, but their physical recovery was far from complete. There was a moment when David nearly gave up. One evening, after another failed attempt to get the male to come closer, he sat outside the enclosure, exhausted. The emotional toll of the constant setbacks weighed heavily on him. The lynx bulls seemed as distant as ever, and no matter what he did, it felt like nothing was working. "Maybe I can't do this," he whispered to himself, his fingers rubbing the back of his neck, the frustration bubbling up. Just as he was about to walk away, the unexpected happened. The male stepped forward, slowly at first, with hesitation, but then with more confidence. His amber eyes never left David's, but this time, there was no tension, no sign of retreat. The male stopped just a few feet away, sitting on the ground, his breathing steady. It was a breakthrough, a moment of trust David had almost given up on. But no sooner had David begun to smile, feeling a sense of relief, when a new threat emerged, something that would test their bond and survival even further. A sudden storm rolled in, the sky darkening with clouds that seemed to threaten an intense downpour. The winds picked up, whipping through the trees surrounding the enclosure. Then, as the storm intensified, a predator, an aggressive wild dog, appeared at the edge of the reserve. Its eyes were focused on the lynx bulls, and its posture suggested it wasn't just curious, it was hunting. David's heart raced. The stakes had never been higher. The lynx bulls, still not fully recovered, were vulnerable. And now, with the storm in full force, David had to make a split-second decision. Would the lynx protect themselves, or would they revert to their natural instincts and flee? The tension was palpable. The storm had intensified, the howling wind sending trees swaying and rain lashing against the shelter. David stood, drenched, outside the enclosure, his heart racing as the predator, a wild dog, advanced, its growls echoing across the reserve. The lynx bulls, though still wary and recovering, had come a long way in their rehabilitation. Their bond with David, once tenuous and fragile, had grown over the months. They were no longer the same frightened animals they had been upon arrival. The larger male, his fur now thick and glossy, watched the approaching wild dog with intensity. His muscles were no longer just thin layers of bone and skin, they were solid, strong, built for survival. David, having witnessed the lynx bull's gradual progress, felt a swell of hope. Could they protect themselves, and him, against this threat? The wild dog growled again, its eyes fixed on the two lynx bulls, its intentions clear. David took a few cautious steps back, aware that the lynx's natural instincts would take over. His thoughts were clouded with concern. Could they fend off a predator like this? They were still recovering, still building strength. But as the dog crept closer, something shifted in the lynx bull's behavior. The larger male stepped forward, his body low and tense, his hackles raised. The female, previously hesitant, moved to stand beside him, her posture no longer frightened but resolute. The wild dog, sensing the shift, hesitated, its posture now uncertain. It wasn't expecting the lynx bulls to face it head-on. With a sudden, coordinated movement, the male lynx lunged, releasing a guttural snarl that reverberated through the air. The wild dog recoiled, its eyes wide in surprise. The female, fast and agile, darted to the side, flanking the dog and forcing it into the open. Together, the lynx bulls presented a united front, showing no sign of backing down. David stood in awe, his heart racing. The bond between him and the lynx bulls had evolved into something far greater than he could have imagined. These were no longer animals merely dependent on him for survival, they were now his protectors, fighting to defend him. The wild dog, realizing it had underestimated the strength and courage of the lynx bulls, gave one final growl before retreating into the forest, tail between its legs. David's legs shook with adrenaline and exhaustion. His clothes were soaked, his body physically drained from the storm and the tension of the moment. But as he stood, watching the lynx bulls guard their space, he felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. They had repaid him in the only way they could, by protecting him. The bond they shared had shifted from one of dependence to one of mutual respect and loyalty. In that moment, David understood that they had become more than just his rescued animals, they had become his family. The emotional toll of the past months melted away in that single, powerful exchange. The lynx bulls, once fearful and distant, had become his protectors, showing him that they, too, had found a place in the world he had helped rebuild for them. Their loyalty was a gift, one that would never be forgotten. David's journey with the lynx bulls had been a long, challenging road, one filled with moments of doubt and frustration, but ultimately, it was a testament to the transformative power of compassion. When he first arrived at the shelter, the lynx bulls were fearful, distant, and in desperate need of care. They had been through trauma, and trust seemed an impossible goal. Yet, through patience and unwavering empathy, David built a bond with them, one that grew stronger with each passing day. He learned to read their subtle cues, to respect their space, and to understand their needs beyond the physical. The connection between David and the lynx bulls deepened not just through his acts of care, but through mutual respect. Over time, they learned to trust him, and in turn, he began to see them not as rescued animals, but as resilient beings capable of forming powerful bonds. In the face of danger, when the wild dog attacked, the lynx bulls proved their loyalty by protecting him, something that no one, not even David, could have predicted. It was a profound moment, one where the lines between man and animal blurred, and a true partnership was born. Their rescue was not just a victory for the lynx bulls, but for David as well. It reminded him of the impact that wildlife conservation can have, not just on the animals we save, but on ourselves. Compassion, care, and respect for all creatures are not just essential for survival, they are the foundation for a world where both humans and animals can thrive together. If this story touched your heart, hit the like button and subscribe to our channel.